Hi everyone, Richard Harris here with Sales Hacker. Very excited to have you for this webinar. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to join us. Before we jump into everything, we got our standard housekeeping things we want to cover. One, yes, the session will be recorded, so if you want to come back and listen to it again or share it with someone in your office, we highly encourage you to do so. As you know, we do like super interactive webinars, so feel free in the questions or chat box to, particularly in the chat feature, go in and introduce yourself, let people know who you are, what the name of your company is, how big your sales team is, or just something fun about you so we can keep dialogues going. And of course, ask questions along the way. We will certainly do questions at the end, but we certainly like to hear them along the way. One thing we're going to do that we haven't done in a while, we actually are going to run a poll later on. So after we get to about the, I think the 8th or 9th slide, we'll let everybody know that there's a poll we want you to take, and we'll share those results with the team. So thank you very much, and let me just start by announcing that we're here to talk about how to build playbooks that salespeople love and use, because let's face it, sales books are some of the greatest thought ever captured out of our mind, put on paper, and then stuck away somewhere. We've got two great leaders joining us today. Daniel, and I'm going to mispronounce your name, I hope not too badly, Zamudio, who is the founder, is the CEO and founder of Playbooks, a sales enablement consultancy software company. They specialize in developing and delivering technology that enables the sales process through playbooks and training. He's actually honed his management skills over the years at big companies that we all would love to sell into, so maybe he'll give us some tips there. Xerox, Gartner, Symantec. Went to Cal over here in Berkeley. He's lived in Europe for 6 years during his life and is a big FC Barcelona fan. So, Daniel, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Really excited.
Great. And we also have Gene Pimbleton. Gene is the Director of Higher Education at Hustle. Gene worked as an annual fundraiser and volunteer manager at the University of Chicago before relocating to the Bay Area, where she worked as a major gift officer at Stanford Law School. She currently oversees sales and partnerships and marketing for higher ed division over at the peer-to-peer texting startup Hustle. So, Jean, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Richard.
And again, is it Cubs or White Sox for you, Jean? We want to be respectful.
Cubs all the way. Cubs all the way.
Okay, just checking. Awesome. Well, I always sort of ask every webinar when we start these things is, why are we even talking about this, right? Like, haven't we, like I said, people have been doing playbooks forever. So, yep. What's changing? Like, what are you guys seeing where's the gap, and why are we doing it and discussing it?
That's a great question, Richard. You kind of teed it up here for me. So we are going to talk about a topic that, we believe is essential for enabling sales success. And to Richard's point, it's not just building a playbook that salespeople love, but it's one that they use, right? So it's one thing for people to get these playbooks, hey, we love it, we love the graphics, it's beautiful, and then they take it and they put it on their shelf on top of the other 5 playbooks that they've collected over their career. So how do they use it? So the first thing we're going to talk about is the purpose, which is very specifically, this section here is designed to answer Richard's favorite question, which is why are we even talking today. So we'll start out with a discussion on the purpose. We'll then talk a little bit about the best practice principles for developing a playbook, and then we will talk about how do we drive absorption, adoption, and application of the best practices that are embedded in the playbook. So I'm going to answer your question, Richard, as follows. So, here's a graphic that kind of talks to what I think we all aspire to. Ideally, we want to enable all of our reps to sell like our best reps. Inevitably, whether you have 20, 200, or 2,000 salespeople, there is a subset of top performers whose behavior you wish you could clone. Ideally, what we want is to help our middle of the pack reps in particular and our new hires to consistently and quickly replicate, what our top reps, do on a day-to-day basis. Ultimately, what we're after is to, from a playbook perspective, is to capture and codify the very best way to sell at our companies, right? So your sales leadership might be conversant in Challenger, Miller-Heiman, Sandler, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, what we want, there's a set of proven best practices that have been demonstrated to help you close your biggest deals, accelerate sales cycles, et cetera. That's what we want to codify in the playbook. The next critical reason for the playbook is because it is the document that bridges the gap between the strategy that's formulated and aspired to in the boardroom that you want executed in the field in the bullpen. So, done right, the playbook provides very clear guidance on exactly how to execute your growth strategy. The other critical piece for the playbook and why we're talking about this is that it is, we believe, the most important coaching enablement solution. So we're going to talk a lot about sales manager enablement today, but think about it this way, is, going to the analogy of a football team, which is where the, playbook concept comes from. Imagine a coach going, into the season saying, hey, we don't have a playbook, just do whatever the heck you want to do. And that sounds a little bit like our San Francisco 49ers who are 0-5, but it's the key point here is that no playbook, no coaching. So that's another key reason for doing this.
I have a question for you around that, right? Because I feel like the gap is in the manager, right? And I don't know if we're going to talk about this, but you can have the world's greatest playbook, but if the manager doesn't get out from behind the CPU and actually sit next to the reps and listen to calls and do actual coaching, then again, the playbook's just as bad. So I agree that absolutely a playbook is critical, but I do think there's something to be said for who's responsible and accountable for implementation of the playbook besides the reps.
That's a great point. I mean, that's a critical point. In fact, it's probably the most important point because you think about it, to the extent that the manager is not, so first of all, to drive this in building your playbook, you want your frontline leadership to be part of kind of building this thing out, right? So they've got their DNA in there, they've got their best practices, you got some from the other reps, but the key to the adoption and application of this is exactly what Richard just said, is making sure that this thing is organized in such a way that it makes it easy for your managers to coach against it. Because to the extent that they don't, then this just becomes shelfware. So that's a really, really key point. Okay, so the other key thing that we like to say is that we believe very deeply is that the sales playbook is truly the foundation of your sales enablement program. And we think this, this is absolutely the case. Mohit Garg, a good friend who's the CEO of MindTickle, he often likes to say that, sales is like, the athletes, right? So the best athletes are continually training. Going back again to the football analogy, what is it that, when a team goes into training camp, what is it that they're learning, or they're supposed to be learning? What is it that the rookies are sweating about and working on every night until midnight? The playbook. Right, so that is the basis for, to the extent that that playbook truly, again, captures and codifies the best way to sell at your company, that it has the tools to help folks do it, then it's the foundation for everything else that you do from an enablement perspective. Okay, so let's get a little bit more practical here, and this is an important slide because it, in essence, defines our perspective on what a great playbook should look like. So, we are, sales process, I've got TQM and Six Sigma tattooed on various parts of my body. We believe, and we'll talk about this in a second, why it's so important, but we think it's just a great framework for how you organize your playbook. So if we look at this here, this is kind of a representative of a SaaS sales process. Kind of left to right, you've had the various sales stages on the top that align to the various buying process stages on the bottom. And then within each stage, you have a set of best practice activities and tools or templates to help execute those activities. I'm going to step through some of these here. So at the initiate stage, we want, one of the first things to do, and here we're making an assumption that we're a little, that we've got a sales qualified or marketing qualified lead. We've started the sales process. Still want to level set, during that initial conversation, where is the buyer in their process? We want to help the rep to create and qualify interest, to assess, fit relative to our ideal prospect profile. If there's a fit, we want to show them how to gain agreement for further exploration, start assessing the decision factors. And some of these plays that you'll see here, it's not always sequential, right? So you can start doing part of the decision kind of factor assessment at the outset. You'll probably do more of it as you progress through the sales process. You're going to qualify. We like to say, you need to qualify early and often throughout the sales process. So anyway, this is kind of some of the key activities in the first stage. Then you've got a set of tools to help with that. So research guide could be, specific to a vertical market. The buyer role, right, super important here. This is, kind of your buyer personas. What are their roles, their responsibilities? What are the metrics that they care about, that they get bonused on? What are the issues that are keeping these folks up at night? What are the use cases that they're, focused on? What are the processes they care about? What might their organization look like? What are the industry trends that are impacting their day-to-day? So these are things that, that define your playbook, right? These are tools. This is kind of the high level. The playbook is everything behind this. It's the documentation of everything that I just talked about. At the discovery stage, go for it.
Sorry, real quick, because this looks beautiful on paper, right? Like I love this.
Yep.
But I am curious to, and certainly Gene, you can jump in on this one too, is how many people need to be involved in creating the playbook, right? There's one thing to say, hey, we need a playbook and the head of sales should do it, but you do want to make sure that you're not overlooking something from marketing, and you do want buy-in from the reps. Like, how do you decide to build a playbook and incorporate the right amount of people without having too many cooks in the kitchen?
That's a great question. Go ahead, Jean.
I can check. Yeah, I was going to say, for us, I think it was really important to have involvement at all levels of our organization, because that informed ultimately what was produced and then represented the needs and I think requirements from a managerial perspective that we wanted to see everyone from SDRs all the way up to our
Hello, did we lose Gene?
Yep.
From SDRs all the way, there you go. We heard you right up until you, from SDRs to something else, and we lost you.
Up all the way up to our COO, who now oversees our sales.
Got it.
Yeah. That's a really important question, Richard, because it's interesting. This is an important point. So a lot of times when folks think about sales process, they think about it almost exclusively from the perspective is, how do we guide our rep to manage, initiate and facilitate the buying process is kind of what we put down here. But beyond that, there are a lot of folks, there are a lot of key internal stakeholders whose input is required. So in the case of Hustle, this is a great example. We met with their head of sales engineering, right? So one of their key stages is the pilot stage. And so we were very involved in defining, hey, what are the best practices? What are the key questions that should be being asked? So we've seen it kind of in some cases where, it's a handful of people to we've had other cases where we've had like a couple of dozen involved. That's too many. You got to figure out, who are the key players. And then the other key piece too is that, now with technology, you want to get it right the first time, but now you have the opportunity to iterate. So it's, before, because it was kind of all this paper-based playbook, you got to make sure that this is rock solid right out of the gate. Now you can get something that's really, really good, but also then crowdsource it, continue to kind of get input. But you're right, you need multiple people involved. Ideally, you want some of your top performers, some of your frontline managers, folks in product marketing who are great wordsmiths. Your CEO, in many cases, we've seen this. It's so strategic that the CEO, hey, what's the founder story? I mean, part of the thing we're doing with Hustle, we're incorporating what prompted them to start the company, right? That gets embedded in some of the messaging. So great question. Okay, so anyway, I'll go quickly through some of these other things here. You can see, again, what we're trying to do is define some of the key kind of tools and best practices. Some of the tools we think are really important are, so the discovery guide. The discovery guide is not just a set of questions. It's a messaging framework. It could be structured around the context of the challenger sale or spin or command of the message, and there's a lot of different kind of formulations. We've got a model that we follow. But you want this discovery guide to be a framework that helps the rep to explore, expose, and expand the need for your unique capabilities that surfaces the cost and risk of inaction. So you want that to be, provocational, include some insights. There's a certain logic to it. There's some key phrasing that you want incorporated in there. So that's probably the most important tool. The other thing we like is the notion of journey stories. And what we mean by that is the customer journey, right? Not the buyer journey, but the customer journey for you to share with your prospect in terms of, so when somebody else was at this particular stage in their buying process that we worked with, here's what it looked like. Here's what triggered them to finally pull the trigger and say, yeah, we absolutely have to take action because the current state is no longer good enough. So those are some of the key things here. Let me pause here. Any questions before I move on?
No, I'm not seeing anything come up at the moment, so feel free to continue.
Okay, cool. All right, so this is kind of like the template and the outline for the playbook. So why the big focus on sales process as the kind of designing philosophy behind it? It's proven that, sales process prowess pays off. I learned very early on in my career that the key to sustainable, scalable, and repeatable and predictable sales successes is the ability to define, execute, monitor, reinforce, and evolve a repeatable sales process. Lots of research points to, the companies that do the best job at this, outperforming their peers across key metrics. The problem is that that's not always easy to do. So there's some research from good folks over at CSO Insights that shows that the grand majority of folks, is much even, they might be very process oriented, but it's just kind of difficult to pull off. So we have this notion of kind of the sales process execution maturity kind of continuum, which we'll talk about here in a second. But to the extent that you're able to do this well, you see the delta between the companies that do it great and the ones that don't do it so great in terms of, in this particular metric, number of reps at quota. So to the extent that you do this well, it's really important. So now what we want to do is actually take a quick poll and assess, kind of learn from the group, where do you see yourself relative to this continuum, right? So you've got a kind of level 1, which is pretty much everybody doing their own thing. Level 4, everybody doing the best thing, continually, reinforced, continually evolved. Where do you see yourself? So let's do a quick poll on that.
So of course my computer decided to do exactly what I hoped it wouldn't and lock up on the poll results. So I'm going to ask Alicia if you can jump in. Here we go. I'm seeing the polls come in. Why don't you go forward for a second and I'll see what I can figure out on the poll. All right, here we go. I got it. So we have the answers so far. We have 15% chose number 1, random, lack of a single sales process. 38% chose 2, informal, have a documented sales process. 40% chose number 3, formal, and 8% chose number 4, dynamic.
Oh,
so it looks like we're right in between that informal and formal place.
Yeah.
So, and is that aligned with what you normally see and hear when you talk to these things?
Yeah, it is. And it's interesting, and it's a good segue to our next slide, because this is the issue that we see. The big dilemma we see in the marketplace is just the kind of, we call it rampant inconsistency, right? So you've got the scenario here. This is kind of level 1 up here, right, where you've got, or level 1 through 3 almost. You've got, either people are doing their own thing, or some people maybe are doing the right thing, but there's just no consistency around it. And it's interesting, I was at a major company yesterday. They've got like 2,000 salespeople, and we're talking to some of the sales enablement folks there, and this is like the only slide that I typically show. And they're kind of nodding their heads saying, yep, this looks like us. So it was interesting to see kind of what the poll results were, which, this is, yeah, absolutely, Richard, this is what we're seeing in the marketplace. So a big part of, why a playbook, why, we've been talking about playbooks forever, right? It's not a new term, but why so important? Because to the extent that we can help folks make this shift from everybody doing their own thing to everyone consistently doing the best thing based on their proven best practices, great things can happen. And it's very critical, particularly for early stage venture funded companies, to get this right, because to the extent that you don't, it can have a pretty severe negative impact on your growth trajectory with it, which then obviously makes it more difficult to raise the kind of capital that you want at the valuations that you want, when you want it, from who you want. Okay, so let's now kind of make this real. I'm going to turn it over to my partner in crime here. Gina and I are now joined at the hip. Talk a little bit about kind of what's transpiring at Hustle, what this looks like in the real world scenario, and we'll go from there. Hi, Gene.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan. I appreciate it. So first, I thought what might be helpful is to just give a little background on the company that we always hear has a cool name, but what do you do? So let me flesh that out a little bit. So our company is called Hustle, and it is a peer-to-peer texting company. So we were founded about 3 years ago during the initial phases of the last major election cycle. And we were founded because we realized that people are just not picking up their phones. They are not responding to emails. And the most efficient and effective way to reach people these days is often via text. And so we were built from founders at First Data Scientists at Facebook, and we have since expanded beyond the political space. We worked with the two major presidential campaign candidates during the last 18 months, and have since expanded beyond politics into nonprofit and advocacy verticals, into our labor vertical, and now into higher education as well. And so as we've gone through this expansion process, obviously, as I'm sure you can imagine, it's required formalizing some of the processes that when we were a scrappy startup just working with political campaigns that had money to burn in 6 weeks and wanted to sign up and go from there, we've since had to formalize things a bit. So, what I'd love to talk a little bit about today is how we arrived at the decision to begin to really structure our sales process, and why that was so important for the company. So,
okay, Gina, if I may, let me just interject here for a quick second here. This is a critical point here that I want to interject here, because what we're seeing here is kind of the sales playbook charter, and while this is somewhat kind of what we're doing at Hustle, it really also represents what we're seeing, kind of the need that we're seeing across a multitude of particularly enterprise software companies. So the key point we've made is enabling process execution excellence, but beyond that, a key kind of goals for a playbook is to turn your SDRs into vertical market SMEs, right? The SDR has, I believe, the most challenging job in sales. They're typically the most junior people in your sales organization, responsible for the most important part of your sales process, calling on senior level, tech savvy, business savvy decision makers, trying to convince them to start a buy cycle with you. So that's key. The second piece, we talked about this a little bit earlier, is kind of the importance of improving discovery conversation, that first call in particular, that first kind of appointment where you have with the senior decision maker. And then thirdly, to enable the entire kind of execution of the customer life cycle, from inception to the opportunity management and the growth. And then lastly, a really critical piece, particularly for young companies, is to you have the playbook help turn your first-time managers into great coaches. So, okay, so let me just I wanted to put that as a backdrop, but now all yours, Jean.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that. So, going back to why we felt this was going to be important to do. We have our SDRs, we have reps, we have managers, but we were launching in these new verticals, and we wanted to make sure that when we did launch, we did it properly. So our goal was really to enable our SDRs, reps, and managers to rapidly. So we wanted them to quickly get up to speed on how to do things properly, but to do it in a way that was sustainable and to just continually apply Hustle's sales framework and call framework forecasting at each stage of the sales process. And again, across these verticals where we were beginning to track. So what does that look like? For us, I can talk a little bit about how we enabled this. So it was on the deal management side of things, as Daniel alluded to earlier, the call management side of things and forecasting management side of things. And in these verticals where we were launching in higher ed, in nonprofit, in advocacy and labor, we did find that, just as Daniel mentioned, for these key roles where SDRs were going to be interfacing with senior level executives, it was difficult to hire SDRs that had vertical market experience in these different verticals. So they might have come from, we needed them for higher education, but they weren't able to describe any kind of, use any buzzwords or really describe the higher education alumni relations and development process, for instance. And so we knew that we needed to hire folks that even if they didn't have this vertical experience, we could train them through this repeatable process to really get up to speed quickly on the vertical that they were going to be working in. And,
so Jean, I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
So how big is your sales team now?
Yep, so our sales is around 20 people at this point.
Okay, and when you first started to analyze that this is going to be a challenge for us, that we need help with a playbook, right? How big was the sales team at that point?
Then it was fewer than 10 people.
Okay, so I want to put that out there, that this is not something you need to wait until you have, umpteen salespeople. In hindsight, do you wish you'd have started this process at 4 salespeople or 5?
We'd actually started it before we even conceived our sales team.
Okay, so you were working on it very early on as part of what you guys were doing. So the integration of sales was, and I'll put words in your mouth, equally as important as the development of the platform itself from the tech side. Definitely,
and I think that for us, it's been to make sure that since our company is in such a growth phase right now, that we're really just laying the foundation for sustainable practices and sustainable growth early on, and that's why it was important for us.
Yeah, let me interject something here, if I may. So their head of sales is just one of the most sales process-centric folks I've met. I think he's got a computer science background. Maybe that explains it. But he, and hats off to him, because he really recognized that in order to scale the company, that they needed to have a sales process well defined out of the gate. In fact, there's a slide here that we showed here. He literally has written a sales process manifesto that everybody almost like needs to read and sign. He's so focused on that. So and which explains the great funding that these guys got. But he's very, very, very process oriented.
Yeah. Does that answer your question, Richard?
Yeah, no, totally. I just wanted to sort of give some context for people that they're, it's never too early to start was really what I was hoping for, but I wanted to, tell the story as opposed to just make the statement.
No, absolutely. It is absolutely never too early to start. And I think for us too, especially as we were hiring these SDRs and account executives that needed, because we were so small, we needed them to be able to, if needed, switch to working in another vertical when we needed help in that one. And so that was also a challenge. We needed people to really be fluent in the fundamentals so that they could work across verticals. Another, I think, challenge for us was that we had folks coming in from different backgrounds. So not everybody on our sales team comes from sales, and I'm a perfect example of that. I come from fundraising, so I've worked with 6, 7, and 8-figure donors to get 6, 7, and 8-figure gifts. But that's very different from working in a more traditional sales environment. And so for us, it was important to make sure that we had this to be able to offer to our reps and even our managers who came from different backgrounds. So I can talk a little bit now. Any questions on that? I should pause and see if this is resonating.
Yeah, well, we did have a question from the previous slide, which was, some people would love to see the forecast status check or the guide from the previous slide. What were stages and steps did you use? So my guess is that they're asking a little bit about what's your exit criteria or entry criteria from one stage to the next as it relates to the playbook.
Right. Yeah. We'll show that, actually, a little bit of that in one of the slides coming up. But again, so those are, again, company specific. We'll show. We actually have a specific slide that shows that a little bit later.
Great.
All right, I'm going to the next slide here then.
No, perfect. So, we've titled this one Improved Discovery Conversation Effectiveness. And this was really important for us because we needed to have a framework, since we were, again, so small, but we were having these conversations with really senior level individuals. We needed to make sure that we were able to actually get to those senior level individuals. And so we needed to make sure that we were equipping our SDRs and in some cases our account executives, if they were doing some of their prospecting as well, to have a framework that prepared them for every call that they would have to really get as far up the chain as they could, especially since they were going to be working in multiple verticals and needed to have something that, regardless of the vertical they were working in, would be applicable and would allow them to reach, to get as high up the totem pole, if you will, as they could. So
I have a question on this one. So, just real quick, when you're putting together this playbook, right, and you've got multiple verticals, I often think people can get, can't see the forest for the trees, right? Is it smarter to focus horizontally about the different titles at each vertical, or is it smarter to choose a vertical and then create these, these conversation guides or battle cards for that entire vertical, so that if I'm selling into higher ed, I'm going to do all higher ed, and I'll get to fintech after I complete the higher ed battle cards? Or is it better to say, well, if I'm talking about the CMO at higher ed, and then I'm talking about the CMO at fintech, to do them that way? Any best practices there?
So what we chose to do, and Daniel, please feel free to chime in here, is we wanted to make sure that there was dedicated content and material and thought for each vertical. So we designed alongside Daniel previously and with his guidance, vertical specific questions that would really allow the SDRs and the AEs to be equipped with the language that was specific and that communicated to folks in that vertical that they knew what they were talking about, essentially.
Got it. Thanks.
I think that's a best practice, and it's in terms, because your go-to-market strategy. So it's interesting, Richard, because what we're doing here is we picked one vertical first, though. So we didn't build, in simultaneously 4 different playbooks. We're focusing initially on the higher ed playbook and using that as the basis for kind of the formula to use for the other playbooks. So that's kind of the approach that we're taking there.
Got it.
All right, Gene.
Great. So, the next thing that we can talk about is just kind of the life cycle of the customer and managing that. And we wanted to be able to, and this maybe touches a bit on the question from before, enable effective execution between roles throughout the customer life cycle. So we wanted to essentially put in place a process, after we'd equip the SDRs with the discovery call questions and that framework, also design, not just kind of leave them hanging, but then design the next step in the process where they would then transition that opportunity to an AE. And once the AE had worked with them, to then transition that client to an account manager. And because we were just getting started in this, there wasn't a lot of coordination around this. Honestly, it was a lot of wheeling your chair around to the person sitting right next to you saying, hey, just wanted to let you know this terrific customer is coming your way. And that was essentially the extent of our customer lifecycle management. It involved just hollering across the room. And so we obviously knew that we needed to formalize that a bit. And that was another reason why we felt that structuring the process would only help us be able to scale faster and then more efficiently.
So going back to Richard's question here, the other thing that we're doing is we're actually creating role-specific playbooks. So we've got SDR playbook, which is by the vertical, and then we're also now going to be building renewal and growth playbooks for the AM organization. So this is super important for any SaaS company. Right, and so you want to make sure you're doing a great job of delighting the prospect, throughout their buying journey, and so equipping everybody with the tools that they need. But then, once you kind of land the deal, then how are you going to grow it? So the next phase that we're going to be working on is building out renewal and upsell playbooks with the account management team. All right.
Great. And then the last thing that I'll chat about here is something that is near and dear to me. I had managed, but I managed when I was in higher education, which is a very different atmosphere and environment from managing at a fast-growing startup. And so we needed to make sure that we had a framework for managers to be able to coach consistent best practices and actually apply this deal management, role management, best management structure that we put together. And some of the challenges there were that a lot of us, again, came from other verticals, essentially, if you will, that we're now working in, but came directly from those fields. So my counterpart came from political and worked on major presidential campaigns, but had never worked in a startup before or a traditional sales organization. My other counterpart came from working directly in labor unions, again, great experience, but had never worked in a traditional startup or sales environment. And then I came from higher education. And we all began at Hustle. We were brought on because we do have experience in the space, but there was definitely a learning curve for us as sales managers, and we were really appreciative of the organization investing in this kind of structure to best equip us with the resources we needed to be able to effectively manage our verticals. Obviously, I don't think anybody's ever worked at a startup or even thought of a startup without also thinking of just not having a lot of time, limited bandwidth, fast, and that's definitely the case at Hustle too. It's busy, and so we needed something that could be applied quickly, but that was also something that we could really, that would provide a sustainable framework for us. And that's exactly why we reached out to Daniel and why his help has been so invaluable for us.
Thank you. So the other key point here that I like to make is that, and this is, and Richard, I'm curious to get your perspective on this. We're seeing this a lot in the Valley, where you have fast growth companies that are promoting from within. So you've got, they're promoting folks who are great salespeople, who are busting quota every quarter, every year, and now they're first-time managers. And so they're first-time managers, and then they're growing fast, so they're hiring a lot of people into the company. Yep. So you got this perfect storm of first-time managers managing new to the company, employees, and that could potentially be a recipe for disaster. So, one of the key things here in terms of the playbook is to help provide these folks with a framework to help them coach. Richard's thoughts on that?
Yeah, the biggest challenge I see is, and I'll be respectful to everyone as much as I can, but most organizations want to do better, faster, and cheaper, and they can't do all three. So they think that faster is always better, meaning they won't take the time to build these playbooks as effectively as you've written them, right? Yep. And I think that's the biggest challenge I see, is that they don't understand that actually you go faster long-term by slowing down now. You actually scale faster that way. And I think that's, and I point my finger at startups all the time. However, I'm sure that's been in existence since businesses have been around, right? Forever. That everybody just wants to go fast, fast, fast. But certainly in the advent of the VC world in the 80s and 90s. So people want their money back as fast as possible. So that's the challenge I see. But to this extent, if you've got a company that gets it and understands it, and they can go, okay, that works, then they'll see the value and do it. And those are the companies that I think will really turn into the real unicorns.
Yep. No, that's a great point. I think one of the things that we see, one of the questions that you like to ask is, what are the mistakes that folks make? And one of the mistakes that we see people make is they treat the sales playbook as a sales tool. So an ROI calculator is a sales tool. A qualification checklist is a sales tool. A sales playbook is not a sales tool. A sales playbook is how you execute your growth strategy. And so, and as a result, you've got to have, the other mistake that we see is because it's treated as a tool, it's coming out of marketing, product marketing. They're coming in, great folks, but they've never carried a bag before. You need, people to come together at a table, make it a priority, work together, collaborate, and make that investment up front. I agree 100%.
So a couple of questions are coming in from the audience, which I'd love to ask, and I do want to be conscious of time because we're getting there, but these are some good questions. How much time do you think it should take a person on a single person to thoughtfully create the first pass of the playbook from scratch, right? Because I think that a lot of people walk out of here going, oh my God, now I know what to do. And they'll take these screenshots and they'll go start doing it. And they'll kind of forget that, wow, each one of those cubes requires 30 or 40 minutes of thought if you don't know what you're doing, not to mention there's an orange column of them, a green column of them, a blue column, and a pink column, right? So, as people are outlining, where do they start? Maybe that's a better question. What should they start with, and what should be their minimum playbook the first time around?
Good question. Okay, so my recommendation is, first of all, you focus it on your sales process. So that's number one. Then what you can do is just start working it stage by stage, right? So start at whatever you call your first stage and say, okay, what are our best practices there? What are the tools that we need, both client-facing and seller-facing? What are the best practices that we need for each one? And so if you look at it from that perspective and you allocate a week or so to, probably the front end of the process is going to be the most heavy, so you should probably allocate a good month for that. But you're getting folks together, you're talking to the CEO, you're getting some input. So God bless you if you're the only person doing it, because you're not going to be able to do it by yourself. You need other folks to kind of help you with it. You're the project lead, but so that's a kind of good sequence. So think about it. Look at stage by stage, and then try to allocate a certain number of weeks for each stage, and so you can build a good first draft.
That's great. Thanks.
Sure. Is there another question?
Other people are asking for the presentation, which I'm sure that it'll be on the recording or something, so we'll get to that later. Let's go ahead and continue, because I don't want to I'll keep pulling up the other questions, but I want to make sure we get through the whole thing too.
All right, so now let's talk about the critical topic is, okay, we built this great playbook. Now how do we make sure that folks are actually using it, and it's not only using it, but that it's useful? That's why they're using it. So we've got this model, kind of the sales process playbook enablement model. So the first thing we want to do is to help folks learn, right? We talk about stage-specific skills, topics, best practices, and tools. We want to give them the ability to practice those, right, to get to a point where they're certified on it. They're constantly being reinforced, and they get certified on that. So they're going through the boot camp, the training, the online training, et cetera. They're showing mastery of these particular critical topics. But then the critical piece, okay, how do we help to make sure that they actually apply it on a day-to-day? There's a big difference between reinforcement and application. It's a big chasm. It's one thing. Reinforcement is episodic. It's like, okay, we'll do it every now and then. Application happens on a day-to-day basis. It happens at the deal level is what we think. So you do that, you apply, then you want to analyze, right? Okay, so then you want to do some analysis around, okay, what's working and what's not. Looking at, company-wide, team-wide, rep-specific, what's the pipeline look like? Where is it, what's the shape of the pipeline? Is it growing? What are the trends? Proficiency gaps across the different stages, right? So, again, analyze across the team, the reps, et cetera. Win-loss, critical form analysis. So now with that, to the extent that you're doing all this, now you can continue to evolve your playbook, and it's in essence being crowdsourced because now you're getting input from the field, and you create this kind of virtuous cycle. And very importantly, now at the manager level, at the frontline manager level, they now, based on this cycle and this analysis, they can start developing team-specific and rep-specific coaching plans. So what we're trying to do is to leverage technology to create this coaching system that helps the managers coach, but also very importantly helps the reps in essence coach themselves on on their best practices as day to day. So how do you do that? So the first thing that we did at Hustle is we organized their university in the context of their sales process, with a number of different kind of critical topics that folks needed to master. We then technology enabled them so that they could, as they go through it, right, they go through each stage. So this is an interesting way to organize your sales university, which most companies are not doing. So this is a good way to do it. So now you're providing the rep with some learning paths in terms of the key topic skills, et cetera, and then providing them with activities that they need to do to show mastery of the topics and best practices and skills required for a given stage. In addition to that,
question actually came in, which I think is really relevant. I'm sure there's certain people on the call who are like, oh my God, now I want to go back and revamp my sales playbook. But then you have this other challenge, which is, well, I've taught my reps how to do things a certain way. How do we institute positive change as we roll out a new playbook, right? How do we get the buy-in? It's always good when you got new reps coming in because they won't know the old playbook. Now you got a new playbook or an enhanced playbook. Any advice on change management when it comes to those massively closed-minded sales people like we are often going to be?
It's a really critical question, and I'm glad this topic came up because you know what? This is an important point. This is another kind of mistake people make is they look at the sales playbook as kind of this content management. Sales playbook is a program, and it's about change management. So it's a critical question. So how do you do a couple of things? Number one is as you're building out the next version of your playbook or whatever you've been doing, you got to make sure that you're involving the folks who are doing that, whatever they're doing are doing it really well. So their DNA is embedded in that. And then critical to that is having your frontline managers involved because, again, we talked about earlier, they're the ones who are going to be responsible for executing it. So you as the sales enablement leader, part of your charter then is to coalesce, get these folks to kind of come together and collaborate on building out the playbook, because then it's something that is kind of, grassroots, based on best practice, and people want to follow it. Because if you're capturing and codifying your best practices, your middle of the pack reps, what do they care about? They want to say, hey, what is it that Gene and John and Mary do that are making it to the club every year or getting their big bonus every quarter? Oh, now I have it. Now I've got it in the playbook. The only way you can make that happen is by having that collaborative approach, based on, again, top performer, front managers. Okay?
Great.
Okay. All right. So the other thing that we did here is we built some courseware around kind of key skills, specific to each stage, right? So part of what we do is we built customer specific, so hustle specific. What's the best messaging? How do you talk about the product? How do you do a demo, et cetera? But there's some other kind of key skills that are required, so that's embedded in training. And then what we want to do is, to the application pieces, is leverage technology to then give them the ability to take those, build a sales process-centric playbook that captures and codifies what your top performers say, ask, do, and use at each stage of the sales process, and then make it easy for salespeople to actually apply those to specific leads and deals, in this case within Salesforce.com. Right? So we're taking this is kind of what we talked about earlier. This is page 32, section 2 of your playbook, right? So I like to use the analogy of, Tom Brady. I bring up Tom. He went to my high school, so I can use him. So he doesn't take the entire playbook out into the field, right? He has the risk guide. So this is the equivalent of the risk guide that's going to help the rest. They've been trained on this. They've been coached on this messaging framework. They've role played on it. They've been certified on it. Now they've got it in front of them at the point of need, so the likelihood of their being able to execute this best practice conversation goes up exponentially, and the ability to do that day in and day out. To answer the previous question around the notion of exit criteria, so this is an example, and actually using working with Hustle here, where we identified what are the success indicators that are necessary for each stage. And this is really important. One of the things that we like to say is that the three most important conversations in sales are the sales conversation that takes place between the rep and the prospect throughout the sales process, the coaching conversation that takes place between the manager and his or her reps during the deal and pipeline reviews, and the forecasting conversation that takes place between the rep and the manager and the RVP and the RVP and the EVP and all the way up the chain. So now we've got everybody on the same page in terms of what are the specific success criteria that have been determined to prove that we in fact should move to the next stage, right? So this is a critical part of the playbook. It's not just about the messaging, is how are we going to manage the deal? What is a great deal? What's the flow of that deal look like? And then ideally to be able to... You bet.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and then ideally to be able to do it across multiple playbooks and roles. So part of what we're doing here is we've started with a higher education playbook, but now we're kind of cloning that, and we're customizing, we're building different playbooks, and we're building out playbooks by specific role. So that's another kind of key, that's the notion of then technology enabling your playbook. It's, so the days of the paper-based, the document-based playbooks are quickly coming to an end. It's now with technology you can build and very importantly then iterate a playbook. It's so key. It's hard enough to build a playbook once, but once you build it, the critical success factor then becomes how do we continue to evolve our process, evolve our best practices, et cetera.
No, that's
and then,
great. Actually, I'm going to hold off on the questions because I just want to watch the time and make sure you get through everything, and hopefully we'll have time for questions because we got about 5 minutes left.
All right, yeah, so I'll just jump through these, then to do some level of analysis, kind of this notion of heat map analysis across stages, where with the proficiency levels, maybe looking at your Salesforce reports, and then do some correlation between proficiency and actual performance, the win-loss analysis, and then just the dialogue that you're having with your reps during the deal reviews, right? That you're learning, you as the frontline manager are the kind of the arbiter of best practices. You're kind of hearing what's working, what's not, And then, so you're using those sessions to learn, you're using your team meetings to kind of elevate the team, and then based on those discussions, you now are in that analysis, you're now in position to continue to evolve your playbook and related training. And then just here, kind of the last point is here, this is where the direction the industry is headed, right? So the good folks at CB, Challenger folks, saying from a sales process maturity perspective, where you want to be is having your sales process playbook embedded in your CRM, so your folks, it's where your folks are, right? So now it makes it super simple for them to execute your best practices at the lead, at the opportunity level, etc. Okay, so last couple of points here. I came across this quote. I love it. Is we spend a lot of time trying to teach folks, and it goes back to the kind of the change management question. Really hard to do. Ideally, what you want to do is give folks a tool that through the use of that tool, they're consistently applying and learning and applying the best practices that are part of that change management initiative, which is what the playbook is all about. So okay, so that's it. So impact questions. Happy to. We've got actually a guide on how to build a playbook. So feel free to shoot me an email afterwards, and I'm happy to send it to you. All right, Richard.
That's great. No, and I think maybe it'd be even great if Alicia at Sales Hacker if we could get that guide, and Alicia can send it out as part of the post email follow-up. Not that they shouldn't contact you as well, but it might be a more efficient way. But here's how you can get in touch with Gene and with Daniel. And if you have questions about how they've approached their playbook process, implementing it, building it, designing it, I know they'd love to answer your questions. Obviously, if you have questions about what their companies do, please feel free to reach out to them as well. A couple of questions from the audience before we go. Who was building the playbook, right? So you built this team to build a playbook, and basically you've taken all the fancy Word documents and put them into one Word document, and at least made them all look like one font, right? And maybe added a couple of PowerPoint pictures. But who really owns it? Does it then go to marketing? Do you advise going out and just getting a third party to do it so that it just creates a one less thing for someone internally to do while it's important, the content's there, so anybody can sort of perfume the pig, so to speak? What do you guys recommend? So if they're not hiring you, of course.
No, but ideally you've got, if you have a sales enablement function, then whoever the kind of the team lead for that is, they're the ideal owner. Our perspective is that this should sit on the sales side. This should, this is a sales playbook, not a marketing playbook. It's a sales. Marketing has a seat at the table, but they're not the ones who should own it. That's the kind of the perspective.
Yep.
And ideally, you would want to bring in somebody from the outside to kind of share your best practices that have worked, and that can really accelerate the time to market. We do that. There's a lot of other great consultancies out in the marketplace that are really good at that. So that's the value add.
How often do you update the playbook? How often do you take a concerted effort as a group to kind of go, what's changed in the marketplace? Is that once a quarter? Is there like, now you have a SEAL team for the playbook, right? You have a quarterly meeting to go, hey, marketing, what have you learned? Hey, sales, what have you learned? What's your approach to that?
Yep. So it depends, the question, and it depends on to the extent that you've got your playbook technology enabled. If you've got a technology enabled, we kind of update the playbook almost on a weekly, monthly basis. If you don't have a technology enabled, you still want to have that cadence. You want to have some sort of maybe or quarterly, where you're kind of saying, okay, what are we learning? Maybe, and you have some sort of a system in place to work, where there's chatter or some other mechanism for people to kind of put in their ideas, and you're kind of collecting them over a period of a month, a couple of months, et cetera, and then you're using that to up level.
If you're top level, right, if you're one of these larger organizations where you have a sales enablement team, and like you said, maybe you're updating the playbook, once a month or twice a month, how do you notify the team that, hey, here's a new play, or here's something new that's been added? Is that just sort of through the technology platform? And I don't want to, overly promote a particular platform or product, or is it done through email, or, what have you seen?
All of the above. One of the things, our partner Mindtickle has a great platform for communicating this kind of stuff. Chatter, you're in Salesforce is another mechanism.
Right.
But a critical point, though, Richard, is that it's not enough to communicate the upgrade. The communication really should come at the manager level, because if you're introducing a new practice, you got to train around that. You got to coach around that. So, you know, hey, look, we got new collateral. We changed page 2 of the playbook. No, it's this new practice. Okay, so let's build a little bit of a training and reinforcement around that.
That's great. Couple of quick questions, and then we'll go. I know we're right at the time limit. How do you, if you don't have this technology, so you said through the managers, through email, through other tools, that was good. How do you integrate this tool along with something around the forecasting side of things, or the deal health analysis, right? Like, you know, at some point, you know, we have to be careful that we don't become tool crazy, right? We become so efficient with our tools, we shouldn't actually have to sell anymore. Right, that's sort of my leading joke these days. But any thoughts around that?
Well, you know, I'm going to take it as an opportunity to pitch us a little bit, because that's part of what we orchestrated our application to do, is to be able to not only help facilitate great conversation between the rep and the prospect, but also to help facilitate great forecasting discussions between the rep and the managers. And you know, we've got some scoring things, et cetera. So you know, that's kind of it's an important problem. And you know, that's part of the kind of the mission. You know, part of our motivation for doing what we do.
Yep. Now, there's one more question from someone who's new to sales. Do you think they should create their own playbook? And my answer to that is yes. Do anything that's going to help you get better. If the company can't build you a playbook, spend time reading, researching, writing things down. Make yourself better if that's the place you're at. And with that being said. Gene, is there anything else you'd like to add, or tell a little bit more about what you might be able to help people with if they are interested in something you guys do?
No, absolutely. Thanks, Richard. So, yeah, if anybody has any questions, we obviously work with political campaigns, higher education, labor, nonprofit and advocacy groups, but then we have an entire business development team devoted to expanding our presence among enterprise clients. So, if anyone is interested in reaching their folks faster and much more efficiently than email or calling, let us know.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of texting is going to start to take over cold calling. It's going to be an intrusion for a little while, but I'm curious to see how you guys play with that game in the sales world.
No, absolutely. It's typically we see once people do a quick pilot and they see the response rates and the quality and the caliber of the conversation that they're able to have via text. It's pretty.
Yep. all that fear goes away.
Right.
And Daniel, I know we've talked a lot about what you guys do, but again, if you just want to remind people if they have questions about playbooks or something, feel free to tell them a little bit more.
You bet. Just high level. You know, our mission is to help folks who in the audience to build phenomenal playbooks, help put programs in place to make sure they get executed, and to reduce the amount of time and effort that's required to do that. So that's great. What we do.
Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you for staying with us the whole hour. We appreciate everyone who attended, and we obviously thank our two panelists and our other sponsor, MindTickle, who's represented in logo and in our hearts. So thank you, Mohit. I know you as well. And with that, we'll say goodbye this time until we have the next one. Thanks, everybody.
Everybody, take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye now.